Thanks very much, of course, to Jeff and Annette and Emily for gathering us together. Our panel's task is to consider the role of religion. And we have with us, in order of presentation, Ronen Shoval, head of the Argaman Institute for Advanced Studies in Israel. Now, Ronen could not be with us because of the situation there, but he has prepared a video, and so we're looking forward to seeing that first. Followed by Professor Rob Koons, a man whose reputation I'm sure precedes him. Rob is professor of philosophy at the University of Texas, Austin. He has 5 books and 2 more forthcoming, right? And then Mathis, Bitton, a PhD student in government at Harvard, and you can look for his work in various outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and American Affairs. And I will close this out. I am Glenn Moots, professor of philosophy and political science at Northwood University here in Michigan. So with that, we'll go to the video.
Hello. I hope you have a great convention so far. Unfortunately, I can't participate in person due to the war, but I'm here sending you this short introduction for the Jewish foundations of conservatism. And I hope you'll see it as an opportunity to explore the Mosaic origins of conservatism. So when we think about conservatism, there are basically 2 pillars, the form and the content, which Oakeshott understood quite well. Form is how to be a gentleman, and the content obviously is the political philosophy that is rooted in the tradition itself. So when we think about the form, there is a relationship between liberty and virtue. And this is the kind of understanding that Burke wrote a lot about, that liberty without virtue is folly and vice. And we can see this understanding deeply rooted in the Mosaic tradition, and in a very, very famous text that was written for about 400 years and was published in the 2nd century after Christ, called Pirkei Avot, which, if I have to translate something, would be like what the Father taught us. So we can see it actually started from Moses, that got the Torah at Sinai, and he gave it to the next generation, until it got to the Great Assembly. And there are very interesting concepts which are written there, which all basically showing the relationship between liberty and virtue. One of them, if we can think about, if we would like to look at who is might. So what is it? Which kind of person should be a might person? He who controls his passion. And you can see that the kind of society that we need to build, that we are called to build, is based on people who have might, which means that it's a society of people that can control their passions. Another interesting concept that was developed is the relationship between virtue and ethic. We can find in Adam Smith's book, Theory of Moral Sentiment, that was published in 1759. This book is very, very similar to a book that was published 19 years before that by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, called Mesilat Yesharim, Path of the Just, which, if you read those 2 books, is unbelievably similar, and you might think that maybe Adam Smith knew somehow this book. But again, it's showing that the kind of, what I'm trying to show, that the kind of in order to build a conservative society, there is a big emphasis on virtue and ethics. So the conservative paradox, as I see it, is if many people address Burke as the first conservative, so what did he actually conserve? Obviously, you can't be the first conservative because you have to conserve something. And Burke wrote a lot about some people that gave him his inspiration for his theory, which were Koch, Blackstone, and Selden. All of them refer deeply to the Jewish tradition and to the Old Testament. And I think it's not surprising that they were thinking and taking their inspiration from the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is the book that is full with politics. So if you want to build a society, you have to go back to the sources of the society and the tradition that comes from the Old Testament. John Selden was very famous because he wrote few books, very interesting books. He knew very well Maimonides, he knew very well Gemara, Talmud, Mishnah. he knew very well the Mosaic tradition when he developed his great work. So we can see some way that they are very similar, the law of the Bible and the common law. And I think the most interesting thing is the casuistic law. Both of them are casuistic law and not abstract law. And we know that Burke is really, really critics on abstract law because he sees these kinds of law which will create a cannibal society. So there are a huge parallel between the two. But more than that, I'm not surprised that British doesn't have any kind of separation between church and state, because again, this is a concept that comes from the Bible itself. Also, we can't see this kind of separation in the Bible itself. And it was really interesting to see the coronation of King Charles III. And when I was looking at the coronation, I was like, I know it. And then I knew where I know it from. It's actually, the ceremony is stage by stage, is written in the Bible. So if you really want to understand all the small symbolic things that happen in the coronation, just open the Bible and you will see all of them. So if we would like to go deeper into the ideas, and there are many, many conservative ideas that are coming directly from the Bible. Let's start from the most basic thing, that you have a private property. You can find it in the Ten Commandments, where you shall not steal. So I just want to give a couple of examples how conservative principles are embedded in the Mosaic tradition. So first of all, think about that the law should be defined in one territory and not apply to all territory in the same way. The concept of self-government, that only legitimate rule arises from the people itself. Moral integrity, which means that if the kingdom is corrupt, the kingdom will fall. That the concept that you have to have a limited government. The king cannot take all the gold from the citizens. You have some limitation on the government itself. The concept of rule of law. Okay, the king has to copy the law. He is not the origin of the law. The king is a subject to the law. And again, you have the concept of separation of powers, because the king has to write the law, which is not the source of the law, in front of the priests. And obviously, at the end, we have the concept of public servant, which means that the king has to serve the people and not vice versa. So we can actually see some very interesting conservative values, which are basically written in the Bible itself. Another important aspect of this tradition is that conservative does not oppose change. We can actually think about the word conservatives itself. It's con and serve. Con in Latin means to add something, and serve is obviously to serve. So conserve, to add something and to serve something. So it's inside the word itself. But we can see also, Burke wrote it quite well, a state without a means of some change is without the mean of its conservation. And this is the kind of concept which we can find in the Mosaic tradition itself. The law in the Torah, the oral law in the Torah, called halacha. Halacha in Hebrew means to walk, which means the law itself has to adapt and to change during time. Okay, it has to be related with tradition, but it's not frozen. It has the ability to adapt. Another important aspect is the relationship between liberty and law. We know that for Burke, there is a really big importance that liberty should be limited, because otherwise we can get an anarchy. And this is exactly what we can see in the way that the story of the Bible is built. We have Passover with the celebration of freedom, but right after it we have Shavuot, which is law, meaning without law, you won't have a real freedom. They are connected, and they are connected in the Bible itself by Omer, which is the connection. You have to count 49 days between Passover to Shavuot to show that they are both connected to each other. So freedoms demand law in order to fulfill itself. So in this short introduction, I just wanted to mention that the conservative movement origins are coming from the Mosaic tradition. And when the American founders spoke about city upon a hill, they didn't think about Athens or Rome. They thought about Jerusalem. And this is an invitation for all of us who love conservatism also not to neglect its Mosaic origins. Thank you so much.
Well, I try and do that. Great. So I'm going to turn to Athens for the most part. And I want to thank Jeff Nelson and the other organizers for the chance to be part of this really terrific conference. Burke, Kirk, and Scruton are all great heroes of mine. Fortunately, I never got a chance to meet Russell Kirk, but I did get to know Roger Scruton pretty well. And, they were marvelous, great men. They're part of what I would describe as a sort of conservative phenomenological tradition. We've already talked about this. In fact, what I'm going to say is in many ways building on the remarks of James Matthew Wilson yesterday. And I think that and we should also include in that phenomenological tradition Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer Moore as well. And in each case, they did a great job, I think, of understanding how human being appears to us in our experience. But and here I agree with James Matthew Wilson. I think this phenomenological perspective has to be balanced and supplemented with a metaphysics and with a philosophy of nature, a natural philosophy. And here I think I'm in agreement with some other great Anglican-American conservatives, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, who talks about the need for a regenerate science, which I think is what I'm going to argue for, and then Richard Weaver and ideas have consequences. So I'm going to talk about that a bit. I'm going to give you the structure of the talk. It's going to start out with the sort of typical conservative Jeremiad about how everything's going to hell, and it has been for a long time. Western civilization didn't exist, has already died before I was born, that sort of thing. But then I'm going to turn midway, and it's going to end on a much more hopeful note. In fact, I think that the tide is turning and that conservatism actually find ourselves riding the wave in another generation or two, which will be a really new experience for a lot of us, for sure, if that actually happens. And then I know the title says natural theology, and I will get to natural theology, I think, if I have time. But I'm going to work my way around to it in a somewhat circuitous way. So hold your breath. Hopefully, I'll get there eventually. So where did things go wrong? Clearly in the late Middle Ages, but things go decisively wrong with the Protestant Reformation. Right? So I realize to say that in Grand Rapids is a somewhat imprudent thing, and I should probably be burned in effigy at the very least for what I'm going to say, but I will say it. And actually, I'm saying this as someone who has spent 5/7 of his life as a Protestant, so I have some personal experience here. What Reformation did was inject two great errors into the West: an antipathy to medieval scholasticism, in particular to the Aristotelian tradition, and a kind of radical intellectual individualism in opposition to dogma and tradition. Now it's possible to be a Protestant and still be conservative, but one has to eschew these two errors. Now there was actually, after the Reformation, a period of very dynamic Protestant scholasticism in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And unfortunately, it died out with the rise of pietism, but it certainly could be revived. And secondly, I think to be a conservative and a Protestant, you have to give up or at least radically circumscribe the sola scriptura sort of model. So we have to read the scriptures in the church and with the church, not outside the church and independently of the church, in my view. So these two great Protestant errors are not uniformly present in the Protestant church. They're also not limited to Protestant denominations. Much of American Catholicism and Judaism have been thoroughly Protestantized in the last 100 years or so. Reformed Judaism, I think, through in Lutheran Germany when it was founded, and more so even in America. Catholicism through the Americanist heresies of the early 20th centuries, and then Vatican II, unfortunately, exacerbated that in many ways. So I think as we look forward, it's going to be religious traditions that have been historically marginal in America that will be the seedbed for the revival of conservatism, if I'm right. Traditional Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Orthodox Judaism, Anglo-Catholicism, perhaps, even some non-Western traditions like Sikhism and certain versions of the Indian tradition, perhaps. So American evangelicalism, unfortunately, has really been overwhelmed by these two errors. The marriage of convenience between evangelicals and conservatives in the 70s and 80s was inherently unstable, and I think it's largely disappeared. Millennial and Gen Z evangelicals in America are largely a lost cause, except as possible Catholic and Orthodox converts. So, in fact, evangelicalism is on the path to self-destruction, repeating the mistakes of mainline Protestants of the 50s and 60s. Trinitarian and Christological heresies are metastasizing at an alarming rate. Young evangelicals are embracing all the shibboleths of progressivism and Marxism because, I think, evangelicalism lacks an understanding of the nature of tradition. So, what have been the fruits of the Reformation? Why do I say that's where things go bad? Well, the main fruit was the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Wasn't that a good thing? Capital G, capital T? Well, it wasn't entirely a bad thing. I have to admit, I like penicillin and air conditioning, because of the Texan in particular. But the so-called scientific revolution was mostly a very bad thing. As C.S. Lewis puts it in The Abolition of Man, modern science was born at an inauspicious hour and in an unhealthy neighborhood. Scholars have demonstrated, in fact, that the idea of science, the rise of science, predated the so-called revolution by a long period, beginning at least in the 12th century. And technological improvements go back even further into the so-called Dark Ages, if you look at the work of Rodney Stark. So I think, actually, I would have had penicillin and air conditioning even without the scientific revolution. But what this revolution actually gave us, the actual revolution, was a revolt against Aristotle, and therefore the spreading and the deepening of the other Protestant error, this individualism. All backward-looking thought is now condemned as retarding the progress of science, with a capital P and a capital S. And the hierarchy of church and state have been replaced by a new hierarchy of scientific credentials, a magisterium of fact, as Stephen Jay Gould called it. So modern science, since the scientific revolution, is predicated on three metaphysical errors: the rejection of teleology, or final causation in nature, the replacement of essences and causal powers with abstract laws of nature, and the privileging of the microscopic over the macroscopic. So according to modern science, reality is nothing but the blind motion of particles in space, governed by inexorable laws of motion. These three metaphysical errors have great political and social consequences, all of them bad. So if these errors are going to be corrected, which I think they will be, they will have good social and cultural consequences. So the lack of teleology means an end to natural law ethics and to political theory. Natural laws developed by Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, and Aquinas is predicated on the idea that human beings have a natural end, so-called eudaimonia, felicity or happiness. And all political and legal systems can be evaluated rationally in terms of the degree to which they protect and encourage this natural end. This is the ultimate basis for the idea of human or natural rights, the right to a political order that protects the pursuit of happiness by individuals and by churches and other communities. So when David Hume says that there's no reason to think that wiggling my finger is not as important as the survival of the whole universe, so it all just depends on particular desires you have, he was really fundamentally undermining this idea of eudaimonia and therefore natural rights as well. Now, in addition, if we replace essences and causal powers with laws of nature, and we privilege the microscopic over the macroscopic, this means the end of real human agency and free will. There's no fundamental distinction between human beings and their non-rational environment. Both are simply forces to be manipulated for whatever ends we choose. There's no such thing as personal responsibility. Everything is the result of forces, including social forces, which are themselves the result of the motions of particles that make up the world. Now, in addition, if we privilege the microscopic over the macroscopic, we must treat human beings as machines, operating autonomously and independently of their social and historical context. We can no longer treat membership in a larger whole, such as family, local community, or nation, as having any ontological significance. The wholes in which we believe, to which we belong, extending outward in space and time, cannot, on this view, transform us deeply, any more than they can transform the nature of a vacuum cleaner or a thermostat, let's say. Now, there's no denying that there was some advantage gained from the focusing so single-mindedly on the microscopic and the mathematical and the non-teleological. We learned a great deal about the forces of nature, electromagnetism and gravity and so on, about the structure of the atom, the constitution of material substances. However, this process of analyzing and dissecting things into their ultimate constituents reached its ultimate limit with the discovery of the quantum realm approximately 100 years ago. And we're still figuring out what that means. And I think that people don't yet understand, and I'll argue that the quantum revolution actually a great counter-revolution, that everything that the scientific revolution did, the quantum revolution should reverse, ultimately. Now, in one of the great ironies of history, the most effective refutation of the physicalism of modern science comes from physics itself. Quantum physics, as pioneers like Bohr, Planck, and Heisenberg saw, is forcing us back to Aristotle's philosophy, completing a reversal of the scientific revolution. The quantum revolution is a counter-revolution. Here we see this again in three ways. First of all, quantum physics forces us to recognize the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality. If reductive materialism had been true, we should have found, as we studied smaller and smaller things, the microscopic domain to become more and more definite and exact, But we find the exact opposite. The microscopic world is a domain of amorphous possibilities made definite only at the macroscopic level. Secondly, the phenomena of quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles are not separate and autonomous entities, but derive their powers and dispositions holistically from a wider context. And thirdly, as Max Planck noted, the centrality of a principle of so-called least action in quantum mechanics restores natural teleology to its pride of place in our understanding of the physical world. Now, my collaborator William Simpson and I have been working over the last 10 years to bring out more closely the distinction between the connections between quantum mechanics and Aristotelian philosophy. Simpson came out with a book last year called Hylomorphism. Hylomorphism, it's the matter-form theory of Aristotle from Cambridge. And I've got a book from 2022 called Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature Obsolete? They're both actually pretty reasonable books, priced books, so go ahead and get them. In fact, the whole 20th century, so this is the scientific background. Philosophically, the whole 20th century has been characterized by the gradual recovery of Aristotelian insights. There's been a rediscovery of Aristotle's philosophy of nature and philosophy of science, correcting the misconception that it was dogmatic and a priori. In ethics, the revival of virtue ethics and eudaimonism by philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, who just recently died, Philippa Foot, has restored Aristotelian ethics to the mainstream. And the resurrection of metaphysics after the collapse of logical positivism has brought back to life key elements of Aristotle's system, including causal powers and potentialities, essences and real definitions, So the revival of Aristotelian philosophy of nature, here's if I finally get to the title. The restoration of Aristotle's philosophy of nature has made possible the revival of Aristotelian natural theology, along the lines developed by Avicenna, Maimonides, and especially for me, Thomas Aquinas. So my colleague at UT Austin, Dan Bonadek, and I have just finished a manuscript on Aquinas' 5 Ways, in which we showed that Thomas's arguments for God are not outdated or scientifically obsolete at all, but can be very effectively defended today. And this is precisely because the Aristotelian framework is once again viable. And in fact, it's unavoidable, I think, if I'm right. So it's not surprising that the human soul, natural law, free will, and a classical conception of God form a package deal. If you delete any one of these, the others are no longer sustainable. And once we see that human beings are a part of nature, a special part, but a part nonetheless, a part of a nature created by God, then we can recognize the dignity of the human body and the indispensability of history and community. One of the bad fruits of the scientific revolution was the kind of dualism between the mind and the body, the soul and the body, and the depreciation, therefore, of the value of the human body as such. And the Aristotelian tradition will revive that notion. The teleological structure of human life negates the radical individualism of the modern world. It recognizes that human beings are social and political animals by nature, and that social context transforms us in a fundamental sort of way, especially epistemologically. Now, some conservatives might object that there's a kind of incompatibility between metaphysics and conservatism, and you can find some statements by Kirk and Burke and others, I think, taken out of context to make that sort of case. But the real objection of Burkeans, I think, to the modern project of abstract, a priori, and ahistorical metaphysics it's really an objection to the kind of metaphysics you find in Descartes, Spinoza, and Kant. Aristotelian metaphysics is anything but abstract in that sense. It's concrete, empirical, communal, and respectful of tradition. So if you reject Aristotle, one rejects sound philosophy. If one rejects sound philosophy, one cripples the human mind. That's it. Thanks. Extend.
Wonderful. Thank you to the Kirk Center for organizing this conference. I'm very grateful. I'm honored to be here. My task today is to consider a question or a paradox that seems to have almost nothing to do with this conference. But I hope to convince you in about 15 minutes that this question is not only related to conservatism, but perhaps essential to it. The question, or the paradox, is the following. Of all 3 Abrahamic faiths, why is Judaism at once the most Promethean, that is, the friendliest to technological innovation, but also simultaneously the one that puts such a heavy emphasis on the Sabbath, which seems like a deeply anti-Promethean institution? My argument will be that these 2 sides of the Jewish tradition far from being in tension, far from being a contradiction, are in fact intimately related. Judaism is Promethean because it is the faith of the Sabbath. It thinks of tradition and innovation not as two irreconcilable camps at war with each other, but as two poles oscillating in dialectic that never quite reaches a perfect synthesis. The role that the Sabbath plays in that dialectic, I want to argue, is the role of conservatism in modern Promethean societies. Now, for this argument, I'll have two guides, both of whom are rabbis. Soloveitchik, Joseph Soloveitchik that is, and Abraham Joshua Heschel. The two are often considered opponents on the question of innovation, but I hope to show you that they are closer than they seem. Let's start with Soloveitchik. Perhaps his most famous work, The Lonely Man of Faith, begins with a tension at the beginning of Genesis that has long puzzled commentators. In Genesis 1, we read, "Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." In Genesis 2, by contrast, we read, "And the eternal God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it." For Soloveitchik, these two chapters of Genesis are the different portraits of Adam, and by extension, two different portraits of the human being. In Genesis 1, man's likeness to God expresses itself in man's striving to become a creator. Adam the first, from Genesis 1, is fashioned in the image of God because he's blessed with great drive for creative activity. Adam the first represents the practical side of the human mind, focused on the how more than the why, on the workings of nature more than on its spiritual essence. More practical than metaphysical, Adam the first is overwhelmed by one quest: to harness and dominate the elemental forces of nature and to put them at his disposal. He wants to learn the secrets of nature, but only as a means to the end of domination. For Soloveitchik, Adam the first personifies what later becomes modern science. In short, Adam the first is a Promethean adventurer who explores nature for the sake of mastery. Soloveitchik does not pathologize Adam the first. Far from perverse or undesirable, the impulse to conquer nature fulfills the divine mandate to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Following Francis Bacon, Soloveitchik claims that the human triumph over the cosmos is anything but impious. By reaching for distant stars, Adam the first acts in harmony with his nature, which was created, willed, and directed by his maker, a manifestation of obedience to, rather than a rebellion against, God. Those who abandon the conquest of the earth, then, betray their God-given purpose. Acting in harmony with human nature requires accepting our telos as masters of the earth. Yet Soloveitchik also admits that Adam the second, from Genesis 2, who serves and keeps the garden, personifies an altogether different disposition towards the world. Uninterested in domination, he does not attempt to create a world of his own, but seeks to understand the living, given world into which he has been cast. If Adam the first asks how, Adam the second asks why. His mode of reasoning is not instrumental but purposive, concerned with ends rather than means. While Adam the first anticipates the spirit of modern science, Adam the second anticipates the conservative reaction to it. Comfortable with mystery, he longs for wholeness and cosmic order. In Soloveitchik's portrait, Adam II encounters the universe in all its color and splendor, quote, studying it with the naivete, awe, and admiration of the child who seeks the unusual and wonderful in every ordinary thing and event. While Adam I honors God by exercising his creative powers, Adam II seeks a closer union with the divine by means of prayer. For Soloveitchik, it's no coincidence that Adam II is born out of dust. Formed from the dust of the ground, Adam II represents the humble origin of man. Where Adam I is moved by relentless thirst for victory, Adam II adopts a posture of humility and prostration. He searches for harmony with the heavens above, not mastery over the earth below. He sees in nature not a boundless source of creation and power, but an intricate object of contemplation through which to encounter his maker. Where Adam I transforms the world, Adam II protects it. Adam I is an architect of the future, Adam II a guardian of the present. Now, what matters for our purposes is that Soloveitchik frames both Adams, the first and the second, as necessary and complementary parts of the human condition. In different ways, Adam I and Adam II fulfill the human telos. As Soloveitchik puts it, quote, both Adams want to be human, both strive to be themselves, to be what God commanded them to be, namely man. Yet this complementarity does not resolve the tension between the two Adams. The relationship between conquest and contemplation, between science and poetry, between mastery and humility, or between innovation and conservation, is never one of simple harmony. On the contrary, Soloveitchik admits that the contrast between the two Adams captures a paradox at the heart of the human condition. God tells men to quest for sovereignty over nature and to surrender to divine authority. He wants men to ask how and why, to interpret the world in both mechanical and purposive terms, to inquire into the workings of creation and to admire its beauty. He requires us to master the earth and to stand in humility before the mysteries surrounding us. The two tasks demand different dispositions, yet God asks for both at once. Can the two Adams achieve perfect reconciliation? Soloveitchik answers by the negative. The challenge comes precisely from the irreconcilability of the two, which must coexist without ever fusing into one. The task is not to evacuate or overcome the tension, but to identify with both Adams, knowing that they are and will always remain irreconcilable. We must embrace the two without abandoning ourselves fully to either. Now, Soloveitchik recognizes that modernity favors the Promethean Adam I at the expense of the devout Adam II. As he puts it, quote, "Contemporary Adam I refuses to pay earnest heed to the duality in man and tries to deny the undeniable, that another Adam exists beside, or rather in him. We build spaceships capable of reaching other planets but refuse the mystery of faith, erecting high and mighty towers of Babel without acknowledging the great verity that heaven is yet higher." End quote. In other words, in a modern world where innovation reigns supreme, finding the right balance between Adam I and Adam II becomes all the more difficult, and the task of Adam II becomes all the more important. Nonetheless, Soloveitchik believes that the Jewish community specifically is well positioned to resist the excesses and temptations of modern men, for it has long institutionalized the response to the hubris of Adam I, the Sabbath. What does Soloveitchik see in the Sabbath? Pretty much the same thing that Abraham Joshua Heschel sees in the Sabbath, namely a counterpoint to the excesses of modern Prometheanism, a refuge for Adam II in a world where Adam I has won. As Heschel puts it, the Sabbath represents the sanctification of time. It is, quote, "a realm where the goal is not to have but to be, not to subdue but to be in accord." Heschel's language, which opposes the Sabbath to the language of Genesis 1, echoes the dialectic between the two Adams. In the Bible, the first use of the word kadosh, holy, happens in the book of Genesis at the end of the story of creation, quote, "and God blessed the seventh day and made it holy." In Exodus, in the description of the Ten Commandments, the term holy is applied exactly once to refer to the Sabbath. For both Heschel and Soloveitchik, this is no coincidence. Quote, "The Sabbath is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation." The Sabbath is such a prophetic institution because it seems to anticipate the triumph of Adam I over Adam II, the need for a weekly parenthesis in which innovation gives way to tradition, contemplation, and prayer. As Heschel puts it, quote, 6 days a week we wrestle with the world. 6 days a week we seek to dominate the world. On the seventh, we try to dominate the self. Yet Heschel adds that the Sabbath is not merely a counterpoint or an interlude that defines itself negatively in relation to a more substantive Prometheanism. As he puts it, quote, "the Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekdays are for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but the climax of living." Recall that in Psalm 96, the Sabbath represents the world to come. It gives us quite literally a taste of heaven. Genesis 2 tells us that, quote, "on the seventh day God finished his work," but it also tells us that on the seventh day God rested. How can that be? How can God create by resting? And if he does create something, what could that something possibly be? Heschel notes that the Hebrew word for rest, menuha, means more than mere withdrawal from labor or exertion, much more than freedom from toil, strain, or activity. Like the Sabbath itself, it is more than a negative concept. In Deuteronomy 12, Kings 8, and Ruth 1, menuha is equated with happiness and harmony. In Job 3, it's used as a synonym for eternal life in the world to come. All these passages convey a similar message. The point of the Sabbath, or of Menuha, is not to find a way out of this world, but a way of being within and above this world, not to reject, but to surpass modern civilization. This, I want to suggest, is the task of modern conservatism. One need not be Jewish or even religious at all to appreciate the dialectic between the two atoms or the importance of the Sabbath, or Menuha. From the rabbinic ambivalence towards innovation, at what's enthusiastic at the prospect of creation and fearful of it, all of us can derive a view of the human condition as a constant confrontation between two irreconcilable parts of us. On the one hand, humans are creators through and through, born to remake the world. On the other hand, the impulse to conquer, master, and rebuild requires a counterpoint to sustain itself. However impressive, the scientific mind of Adam I needs the humility and devotion of Adam II. Without the Promethean drive, our creative capacities atrophy, but without its counterpart, our spiritual sensibilities wither away. In both cases, to deny or ignore part of the human condition is to condemn oneself to unhappiness. The task of Jewish thought, Soloveitchik believes, is to oscillate between these two poles without ever letting one consume the other. In a modern world where science, technology, and innovation reign supreme, however, maintaining that balance requires defending everything that Adam II stands for: tradition, contemplation, prayer, mystery, humility, gratitude. Adam II, in some sense, is the first conservative. Like conservatism, he arises in response to something else, but stands for something substantive of his own. He represents an ideal to be cherished, an ideal that institutions like the Sabbath make concrete. Ultimately, that part of the Jewish tradition gives us a sense of the conservative mandate, but also of the means to that mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathis and Rob. My own paper is concerned with the historical case, lest religion become, as it is for the sociologists, for example, mere experiences in which Hindu pushpin is as good as Orthodox poetry. So, in speaking of religion generally, we should not be surprised if both the liberals and the post-liberals see it with perhaps indifference or hostility, but ultimately as a means to their own ends. And to avoid that, I want to repair to the wisdom of Russell Kirk and Sir Roger Scruton and consider the American case in its broader British and European context. The historical tradition under examination is Protestantism. Rob will be pleased to know this is not a defense of evangelicalism, but a defense of magisterial Protestantism, and the magisterials understood themselves to be doing something quite conservative. And both Scruton and Kirk offer defenses of the Reformation and praise of the Protestant character. The magisterial reformers summoned us back to the sources, ad fontes. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of work done lately by Manfred Svensson and David Seitzma on the Aristotelian tradition, for example, among early modern Protestants, and also revival of Protestant scholasticism. These are really good developments. Scruton describes Protestantism as a conciliar faith, relying on discussion, criticism, and reform, whereas Eric Voegelin, for example, scorned Calvin's institutes as a Gnostic Quran. Scruton calls it a candid and honest attempt to think things through, and having a salutary effect on the English church. Regarding sectarianism, the magisterial reformers became magisterial by directing the magistrate to prevent the proliferation of sects and dissenters, preserving what they believed to be Christendom. The reformers did not unleash an unrestrained conscience free from tradition and authority. What Luther meant by the conscience was a coram Deo, putting us before the face of God. The conscience is not to be freed, but instead bound by both the rules of society and the Word of God. No one is empowered to free his own conscience or deem it autonomos. The significance of the believer's free conscience is that it is inwardly free, and therefore not trammeled by outward impositions, especially adiaphora judged by civil or ecclesiastical authorities for unity. This enabled more obedience, not less, to civil or ecclesiastical powers, provided that they understood the difference between the inner and outer dimensions of human life. This explains why nonconformists in England, even under the relatively friendly regimes of Edward or Elizabeth, were counseled by continental reformers like Heinrich Bullinger to be prudent in their dissent. Even if we want to credit the Reformation with, or blame it for, religious liberty, the path is indirect at best, and not landing there for at least a century or two. This will disappoint both the liberals and the post-liberals. The route there was one of conservatism. Circumstance and pragmatism should get the credit. Principled arguments for toleration arguably had little effect, and those who insisted on toleration apart from prudence were considered the secularists of their day. The magisterials gave the civil priority over the ecclesiastical. Althusius, for example, reminds the magistrate not to overreach in ecclesiastical matters, first, because he cannot force the conscience by nature, which makes the question of right, the magistrate's right over it, moot, and two, he may not destroy the civil in the hope of saving the ecclesiastical. Furthermore, the reformers considered persons bound to their station by vocation. Calvin wrote, for example, "Our Lord Jesus Christ did not come to abolish what belongs to the preservation of decency and peace." Consistories joined civil and ecclesiastical authority, often with mercy and forbearance, to discourage what we would now call individualism and moral relativism. Natural order, including rank and status, were to be obeyed as the will of God. Following the example of Aquinas, for example, Luther, Calvin, and William Tyndale applied the Decalogue's command to honor father and mother to civil authorities as well. In short, it is reasonable to see, at least within magisterial Protestantism, something conservative and worth conserving. This Protestant is mindful of ordered liberty and constitutionalism. He is more than a reforming moralist, revivalist, or separatist. This is the kind of Protestant, for example, that Miles Smith writes about in his Religion and Republic. This is an institutionalist, not an individualist. Thanks to what we can thus call institutionalist Protestants, what Scruton says of Christianity in Britain generally could be said of America too. Not only did the magistrate take an interest in its preservation, but Protestantism served as a public faith. It was never, as Kirk says, what we now think of as a private concern in this relatively recent interpretation of the First Amendment that signals indifference or worst, a preference that church and state be separated to rot in separate tombs. Protestantism is part of the British elements of culture, without which, as Kirk says, Americans would have no coherent culture. Its ceremony, customs, and virtues reinforce our attachments to a way of life, and its dogmas come to life in the community adhering to them. Our faith in public life rests and relies on our collective faith. Though establishment was always doomed in America for reasons not important now, Scruton emphasizes that thanks to Roman law, the church emerged from the catacombs as a corporate person, and thanks to English law, it could be a trust of the kind that would preserve the little platoons. What America inherited from England, therefore, was far more robust than a voluntary association, like so many Americans would think of the church today. But what of disestablishment? The disestablishment of churches did not slow Protestant institution building. Instead, disarming sectarianism and promoting ecumenicism accelerated it. The question forced on the Americans, particularly after independence, had previously been forced by the Reformation. What then is a church? The eventual answer was a soft establishment that endured and permeated more of public life than it would in Britain. This soft establishment included not only the creation of educational institutions with robust character formation, but the weaving of Christianity into the common law. Christians and the church enjoyed protection under religious liberty, not in spite of it. In People v. Ruggles, which gave protection against blasphemy, Justice Kent hearkened back to the Roman jurist who insisted that jurisprudence is the knowledge of human and divine affairs. And this was not only the case that sustained blasphemy laws. Kirk notes this with approval in America's British culture. As we turn to the American Protestant temperament, it is deftly summarized in Kirk's Roots of the American Order as a way between two Protestant poles, the desire of Richard Hooker to retain and the desire of John Knox to reform. Hooker was slow to advocate reforms based simply on the claims of conscience, even if seemingly justified from Scripture, without putting such claims at the bar of reason and experience. This reflects the Thomistic tradition, also reflected in the common law of Coke. Likewise, we moderate our application of reason with the circumstances of each polity, and this application to circumstance is found in the law positive. There are therefore trade-offs obliged in every reforming proposal, and the lenses of both reason and experience disable the presumption of a universal pattern for politics. In praise of Hooker, Scruton says that a call for moderation informs every page. Hooker feared the impulses of popular dissent, particularly the more populist strains of Puritanism, in which existing institutions and institutional leaders might be brushed aside. Hooker is very much a man for our time, calling out opponents for imputing all problems to the status quo and its defenders, while proposing their solution as the only remedy, however untested. Hooker discerns in his opponents an impulse to think that the more radical and untested a solution is, the greater its soundness. Those who acknowledge their solution become an in crowd, and everyone else becomes the enemy. Note the Schmittian elements of post-liberal discourse. There can be no fence-sitters, only friends and enemies, especially when our quarrels are cast as existential. In the face of strident critics, Hooker recommended deference to recognized authority, something now anathema in our populist age on the right and the left. And though the idea of recognized authority is understandably more challenging, while our elites routinely fail us, Hooker reminds us that God establishes authority, and however errant it may be, it is likely a better alternative to endless quarrel. In contrast to the moderation of Hooker is the reforming sensibilities of John Knox, whom Kirk says also informed the American character. Whereas Hooker's men were primarily those of Virginia, Knox's were those of New England and the Middle Colonies. Knox is the man who always reads providence into events and calls on it readily to aid the reforming cause. Knox is also a man of covenants similar to those in the Old Testament. These serve not only as a worldview, but a constitution of sorts. They spell out the terms for ruler and ruled, their terms having the effect of limiting power and maintaining the rule of law. They apply to both elites and to the people. When Knox, for example, writes to the people and the magistrate about religion in Scotland, he holds them both accountable for maintaining public piety, a reference to Exodus 30 and preserving the tabernacle. Another way to interpret the Reformed Protestant covenants, however, is through what Scruton says in the face of God. The covenant is more than a law. Scruton says the covenant is instead a subjective view from a transcendental being lying outside our knowledge. This being must be relational if he is to mean something to us, and the resulting relationships are those that we have with us joining the covenant with God, and also, of course, the relationship with God, whom Scruton says is a person who reveals himself as persons do through a dialogue involving I, you, and why. In the covenant, God acknowledges that humans can make up their minds to do one thing rather than another. We are able to take responsibility and offer reasons for action. We face the world, as Scruton says, in a posture of accountability. One sees this accountability in God's encounter with mankind. Come, let us reason together. And in covenanting, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. This is the eye of ordered liberty, sustained only by the right political theology. As I emphasize in my book on the subject, and as Scruton says in The Face of God, the God of the philosophers was described in the third person, not addressed in the second. God is a free agent, too, in the covenant. We are therefore in the covenant before the face of God, in a way that the face is more than merely anthropomorphic. It is recognizable and knowable. This is a person. Kirk's deft handling of these two poles of Protestant tradition and Scruton's philosophical and historical insights demonstrate that we must return to the sources, as the Reformer said, recovering and preserving their wisdom. If we do not, we demonstrate neither the responsibility that Knox advocated nor the prudence that Hooker articulated. Thank you.